This talk is a bit of a departure for software architects. It's not the kind of thing that they normally would do. Frankly, it's a bit of a departure for me, and it's not the kind of thing that I would normally do either. So at some level, I've prepared some information here. I've done a hell of a lot of research, but what I want to do is make this as relevant to you as I can do. So if you've got questions, or if you're here for something specific, then ask me, tell me, and I will see what I can do. I only finished these slides last night. The nature of the subject means that it needs to be reasonably relevant and up to date. So you're going to have to forgive me. I will continue to look at my notes because I have no idea what I'm going to say. Let me ask you, why are you here, guys? What are you hoping to achieve here? What are you hoping to hear me say? Anybody?
Okay, so I come from a regulated environment. We do crunch a lot of data.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been thinking of moving data onto the Azure or AWS or wherever. And there is a genuine concern around the security and privacy of the data because as part of being a regulated business, I mean, we definitely need to count some requirements and fulfill some requirements from the regulator side. That's primary reason for me to be here today, to see what are the options.
Understand. Can you tell me the nature of your business?
It's a large energy management and consultancy business.
Okay, all right, thank you. Yes?
I mean, insurance?
Yeah.
Over the next 5 years, we can see it, streams of information from sensors, from houses and cars and God knows what is coming in, and how much of that information from customers can we actually use to develop risk profiles, what's legally able to use, what can we show back to them, especially if that sensor information involves some other people. If there's a dash cam in a car, for example, and they use that to capture an accident with their car, and then you're seeing a lot more of other people involved. What can we use, who owns the data? When that comes in, all that kind of stuff.
Those are extremely good questions, and that's exactly what I'm going to address. Yes?
What's the relevance of, or what's the extra considerations are there for the big part of big data and privacy over and above data and privacy?
This is exactly what this is about.
Yeah, which is what I'm saying.
Okay, all right. My name is, well, you don't need to know my name, it's secret. We have been using personal data for many years now. We understand what it is. We understand how to look after it. We understand what the regulatory frameworks are around it, broadly. I'm going to be talking a bit more about exactly what this framework is. But one of the things that's happening now is that all sorts of enterprises are moving away from mere personal data and looking for something much larger, this idea of big data. Now, what big data does is it stops caring about the individuals. What it becomes much more interested in is trends and aggregations. And in that sense, what it's doing is it's swallowing up all of that personal data. So the personal data is still there, and the personal data is still relevant and important. But the big data is this sort of new thing, which is adding something else to this mix, to this understanding of what data is and what regulation is. And this is the new thing. This is the novelty which I want to explore, because this is doing something new. This is doing something which we haven't experienced before, and it's creating conflicts which we haven't seen before. Now, I want to start this by showing you two things, two sort of example cases to show you where these conflicts are coming from. This is the first one. Any idea who this chap is? No, anybody doesn't know who this chap is? You're in the wrong room. Now, what he did, he was, you know his story. He was working for the NSA. He left the NSA with some speed and told the whole world that this organization, which was set up with millions of dollars worth of funding to spy on people, was spying on people. And everyone, oh my God, that's terrible. And among his revelations were, they're reading your Facebook page. Facebook. That's between me and 6 million other Facebook subscribers. That's private, damn it. And everybody's getting really upset about this. Now, okay, I can make light of it, and I can pretend that this is something other than it is, but actually, people's upset was real. They were genuinely surprised that this stuff's going on. I would like to know why. I mean, I have asked people why they're upset with the idea. In fact, Americans are more upset than Europeans. Part of what he said, I mean, it wasn't even secret at the time, was that it's not just the NSA. The NSA was collaborating with GCHQ. GCHQ is the British version. This is not a surprise, because since the 1940s, there has been a collaboration of intelligence agencies called the Five Eyes. This is the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. More recently still, and by recently I'm talking about the 1950s, this has expanded to the SIGINT Seniors Europe, which is 14 states in Europe, all sharing their intelligence information. One of whom, incidentally, is Germany, who were really upset by the thought that America was spying on Germans. Now, why are they doing this? I mean, these spy agencies, they spy on people, they listen to people, that's their job, that's what they're set up to do. When they create legal impediments to them doing their job, they go and ask their friends to do it for them, and this shouldn't be a surprise either, and yet people got really upset about it. So why do people get upset about it? I mean, different populations had different objections, but the Americans, they thought that this was a civil liberties problem. They thought they have a right to free speech. They think they have a right to a private life. And they thought that this eavesdropping contravened that right to a private life, and it contravened their rights of free speech. Now, it's quite a hard thing to argue, and the arguments are still going on. And the legal fights are going to carry on for quite a long time to come, but it was about this idea of civil liberties. That's what they're objecting about. And part of what people didn't like was the lack of transparency. They were saying, well, what do they know about me? If I knew that they'd been listening to my phone calls, then it would have been different. Well, how would you have not made the call? But it was the sense that there was this lack of transparency. They know so much more about me than we know about them, and this seems offensive. So that asymmetry seemed important to them. The other thing that seemed important was the idea of a mistake, that they would be spying on you and they would put 2 and 2 together and make 5, and suddenly you were being accused of something which you had nothing to do with, and this would be a very difficult thing to shake off because it was all done in the shadows. You don't even get a court trial about this because it's all done secretly and privately. And that, I think, was the root of what the objections were. And again, I'd like to ask you guys, I mean, you all heard these revelations. You all knew what was going on.
So the objection in this country is we've got the Regulation Investigatory Powers Act, which protects people and provides that transparent layer of, yes, if we're fighting terrorism, they will be able to access it. You've got the 3 strands of the Act. And the last one is data deception. If it's anti-terrorism, they will spy on you and people accept that. But when it's other things or lesser things, they didn't necessarily have that power. So when they asked America to go and do it for them, then it seems to be a contravention of, at the very least, the spirit of the law. So you can sort of understand that, don't you?
Yes, I can. And in fact, that's an interesting case, that what they're doing is, so long as it's against terrorism, then anything goes, because terrorism is such an unspeakable thing. But there's sort of minor offences, like you wouldn't expect them to use this power for speeding offences. That just seems like an abuse of the power. Some things you should get away with. Is that what it means? Well, maybe it does. Maybe. Well, what proportionality of what? Some things you should get away with. And then you get to this sort of grey area where it's very severe, sort of very serious criminal offences, like paedophilia, for example. Now, would it be appropriate for them to use these sorts of resources to track down paedophiles? That's where this whole question becomes much more difficult and much more grey. And this idea of proportionality stops being a legislative thing and becomes a much more judgmental thing. But again, we'll explore that. But yes, point well made. So that was the first case. This is the second case. How many of you are not normally residents in the UK? Okay, this is for you. No doubt if I get anything wrong, there'll be howls of protest to correct me. This is the National Health Service. The National Health Service, the health provision in the UK is, to a first approximation, entirely nationalised. The hospitals are owned by the government. The entire healthcare provision is operated by the government. Doctors are in the government's employ. Even if you want to access private healthcare, your primary means of access is through the state-controlled, the state-owned system. This has been in place since 1948. It took a lot of argument to build it, and it is something which the Brits are inordinately proud of. And we're not normally a prideful race, but this is the feather in our cap. But what's interesting about this is that it was construed right at the very beginning, when they first started talking about it in 1912. The idea was to provide healthcare on an as-needed basis, free at the point of use, from the cradle to the grave. Now, since then, it has turned into a major political football, and it's our second national sport to argue about what's wrong with it. But nevertheless, throughout that time, it has actually delivered what it's supposed to do. It has delivered what, frankly, is first-class healthcare. And in order to do that, it has kept copious and comprehensive records. They have a record going back to 1948 of every single visit anybody has made to a GP, of every prescription that's been written, of every prescription that's been filled, of every surgical intervention, and of what the outcome of those interventions were, everything. They have this extraordinary quantity of data. And over the last 10 years or so, they've taken all of these incredible quantities of paper records. There are warehouses full of them. You should see the pictures. And they've computerized them. And they're now all online. And now, literally, when you can go in and get an X-ray, and the X-ray pictures will be on the radiologist's desk before you leave the room, and the results, the interpretation, will be on the GP's desk before you've left the hospital. And it really is that fast and that efficient. And we've digitized all of the previous data, so we have these records going back to 1948. Now, this is one of the most valuable data sets in the world. This is the kind of thing that could create new kinds of drugs. This is the kind of thing that could change the nature of what treatment is at a philosophical level. If we want to do personalized medicine, we have the data right here to do it. All right, it's biased towards British people, but apart from that, it is absolutely comprehensive. It is absolutely unbiased. So the NHS has decided that they want to release this data in its entirety to people who want to know. And it's called care data. As I say, one of the most valuable data sets in the world. The possibility for public good is almost unlimited. The howls of protest you would not believe. It's been held up twice. I mean, they've got all the systems ready to go. I mean, amazingly, for a public office, they're sufficiently efficient that they have got the systems ready to go. But the systems are ready to go, the data is online, and all they have to do is press the button and plug it in, and it will be online, and they can't do it. Back in January, they sent a leaflet to every household in England. This doesn't apply to Scotland, but they sent a letter to every household in England saying, we're doing this. Do you want your data removed from this data set? Because people, there was such an outcry. And there was an outcry from individuals. There was an outcry from civil liberties organizations. There was an outcry from, even from some businesses. And what people were worried about was a lack of privacy. Now, I'm going to ask you, I mean, some of you are local, some of you are foreign, but I want to ask you how you feel about this. Your data, anonymized data, is going to be made available to drugs companies to make new drugs. How do you feel about that? You in favor? You against? You don't care? You're in favor? You're in favor?
Did you just say your data, anonymized data?
Yes.
Isn't that mutually exclusive?
It's identified, but it is anonymized. So if somebody wanted to, and if they applied for the correct data, then they could trace you as an individual from birth right up to today, or death, or whatever, or abduction by aliens, or whatever has intervened. But they could track that identity.
Number.
That's right.
But anonymization, there's been lots of news stories as how if you start looking at anonymized data, it's very difficult to anonymize it enough to stop people actually working out who's who.
That's absolutely right. And again, this is something that we're going to come back to, because when you have data of that detail, it turns out that there is no such thing as anonymity. What you have is aggregation, but the moment you deaggregate, it ceases to be anonymous to a fairly significant degree. But then again, let's ask the question. Let's suppose that if your data was made available with a number, and if somebody really cared enough to find out that it was you, they've got 1 million records, and they really care enough to find out that it's you, do you object now? See, to me, that seems like such a remote possibility.
If you look at other national databases, like the National ID Scheme,
Yeah.
you can have 80,000 people having access to that database. What's to stop them looking up details of people they know, or people, exes or something like that? But it's absolutely ripe open to abuse.
It is. So they put in place safeguards, and we'll talk about the safeguards. But the point is made that we have this data set, which without doubt has extraordinary value, and yet it represents a danger to individuals, a potential danger, or a potential infringement of their privacy to individuals. So what they've done, and this is probably the time to say this now, what they've done is they've created, broadly divided this data into three groups. There is green data, there is amber data, and there is red data. Now, green data is data which is entirely anonymized. This is aggregate data. There are no individuals left in it. This is trends. There's not even very much in the way of correlation in there, although you can ask for correlations. You don't, this is not public data that you can just sign on. You have to ask for it. You have to tell them why you need it. You have to have a license to use it. But the green data is all the stuff which is aggregated and inherently anonymized. Then there is amber data. Amber data is this pseudonymized data. This is the stuff where it's taken your name out and your address out and it's put a nonce in its place. But other than that, it is detailed. So, for example, somebody who wanted to find a record, somebody who found a record to find that he has Hashimoto's and he has cystinuria and he lives in Scotland, there's not bloody many of us. So that would clearly identify me. Even though it wouldn't have my name on. But so this is the amber data. And for that, you have to have your license and you have to have a real need. And you have, it's not good enough just to use it for trawling. Finally, there's the red data. Red data is personally identified and it is highly confidential. And this is delivered to users on an absolutely strictly need-to-know basis. And that means you're a healthcare professional. It means that when you have your X-ray, then the radiologist sees it and nobody else. And then when the radiologist makes his report, the GP sees it and nobody else. That's what red data means. And that is already in place. I mean, they already have the computers on the doctor's desks. That's already there. So we're not adding anything to that, but they do recognize that this is highly confidential and highly important data. So what were the objections? Why did people dislike this idea? Well, they disliked it because, first of all, this is my data being sold. It's, at one level, they said the NHS is selling my data and making money out of me, which just seems like a really odd thing to say because, well, the NHS sells money, they need less tax. That seems fairly straightforward. But then they said, well, they're selling it to drugs companies. What are the drugs companies going to do? They're going to make a drug and make a profit out of me, out of my data. Except it's not out of my data, is it? It's out of this aggregated data. There was worries about theft. People were saying, just how secure is this data? Let's suppose hackers got in. What could a hacker do with this kind of information? Then they were worried about misuse. Who was it who mentioned insurance company? That was you, yeah. What sort of misuse would an insurance company make of this?
Genetic predispositions to change pricing for vehicles, for example.
Okay. In fact, there's already laws against genetic discrimination. But there are other kinds of discrimination, like if you have a latent diabetes, for example, then they might want to know about that.
Or laws against hacking as well.
Well, yes, that's true. But one would consider that, if an insurance company applied to use the data for the purposes of validating their customers' declarations, that would probably be a misuse. Now, it wouldn't involve hacking. It probably wouldn't even involve a violation of privacy, because if you're going to get your insurance cancelled, you want to know right away. But it would seem to be, at least in the popular mind, a misuse of this data. Here's another possible misuse, an employer. You might not want to disclose to your employer your medical history for a whole bunch of reasons.
Or a day off sick.
Sorry?
Or having a day off sick.
Well, there is that.
Mental illness.
Mental illness, chronic illnesses. Chronic illnesses might disqualify you from promotion or training. There are a lot of ways in which an employer could misuse it. And so this is the reason why they introduced the licensing. Okay, so I've explained to you what the objections are. I've explained to you what the safeguards are. Again, show of hands. Who's comfortable with this? Who's uncomfortable with this? Comfortable? Uncomfortable? Okay. Now, there are other examples of this kind of big data and this kind of misuse. Do you remember the Facebook experiment 2 months ago? Do you remember what it was about? Who doesn't? Okay, very briefly, what they did was Facebook routinely filters the stories that they put on your wall because they couldn't possibly put them all on because you'd just drown. There's too much. So they pick and choose what they think is most relevant to you. They did an experiment where they said, all right, we're going to divide people into these two cohorts. And some of them, we're only going to give them cheerful messages from their friends. And the other group, we're only going to give them miserable messages from their friends. And we're going to look at what sort of messages they then post to their friends. And it turned out that the people who were given miserable messages posted miserable messages, and it basically reduced the quality of their mood. And the people who were given happy messages posted happy messages and cheered up. Well, who would have thought it, eh? What was interesting was that it happened in minutes. Within 8 minutes, people got miserable. And now people are complaining, well, this is an unjustified intrusion, and they shouldn't be experimenting on me, and this is immoral and it's unethical. And but is it immoral? Is it unethical? Is this not a valid use of big data? It's also an extremely valuable sociological result because they found, well, actually, if you want to manipulate a population, this is how to do it. Facebook turns out to be even more efficient than television, which they've done plenty of experiments with already. Tracking cookies is another one. How many of you have got your cookies switched off? How many of you got your tracking cookies switched off? Why? Why do you care?
Because I don't know what's being done with that information. It's about going back to what you were saying before. It's about transparency.
Yeah.
If I know what's being done, I can make decisions as to whether I'm comfortable.
Okay, the way tracking cookies work is that you go onto a website and a third party places a banner or an advert of some kind on your site. And what's happened is you've leaked your data, you've leaked the fact that you've gone to that site to the banner provider. Now, subsequently, when you go onto another site, which is hosting the same banner provider, when they serve the banner, they know you've been on that site. They don't know who you are. All they know is something about your browsing history. So they can't track back to you. Your dirty pictures are safe. But it feels intrusive. It feels like there's somebody looking over your shoulder. They're not actually learning anything about you.
Well, with the exception of the Facebook like button and the Twitter tweet this button, because they do know who you are. And
That's true. That's true. But that's not the tracking cookies. That's a different thing. And that's not something that you can do accidentally or can be done to you surreptitiously. You have to press the button
no, you
yourself.
don't have to press the button. You should have it loaded.
Okay.
Yeah, and then there's been stuff that shows that even if you log out of Facebook, Facebook can still use those cookies because it's got that ID already. It can still track you.
Okay. Yeah. Fair enough. Okay. Yes.
I don't see tracking cookies as any different to using the credit card or the debit card to make payments. Because that data is all sold to people who are buying habits. It's no different.
Sorry. Say that again.
Sorry, I don't see tracking cookies as any different to using your debit card or your credit card to purchase things. You go to Tesco, for example, your data will be sold, your buying habits will be sold to people who are interested in advertising to you, that sort of thing. So, I mean, unless you pay by cash, I think.
Yes. Actually, yes, I concur. It's, when you use a credit card, people know your credit card number and people can see your same credit card number coming back. And if you've got one payment fulfiller, which frequently you have, then they know who they've fulfilled payments from every transaction that you've made. And I'm going to come back to that because that's, what the credit card company knows is really interesting and it's something that we ought to look at. But here's the point. People were so upset by these tracking cookies, and it is the tracking cookies, that now we have a law in Europe to say that if you set a tracking cookie on somebody's browser, You have to tell them so in a great big banner at the top, and it's defacing every bloody website in Europe for no purpose, because there's no information being leaked through this, or no substantive information, certainly no personal information. So, lots of examples, lots of places where this is where people are upset about using information which is not personal information, but is sort of information about them. This is where we're getting into the beginnings of the big data, this sort of impersonal but aggregated data. Now, what is the law today? We need to understand something about what the law is today. This is a heat map from DLA Piper, which is a law firm, which is roughly trying to explain about data protection around the world. What this is talking about is personally identifying data, the kind of thing that law protects now. The things that I want to show you are that the real hotspots are Europe. Europe's a bit patchy, but basically Europe is pretty good. And the United States. There are some odd exceptions here. Hong Kong is one of the best places. Who'd ever have thought that? Argentina is pretty good. And Morocco, that was a real turn-up. I was totally surprised at that. And yet Australia is very weak. In fact, it's got very, very poor protections. But the reason for showing you this picture is to give you an idea of how the world protects personal data, but to explain to you what the next step is. We're going to look at what's going on in Europe right now and in the immediate future, and then we're going to look at what's happening in the US, because they're different, and the concepts of privacy in the two places are different. Okay, Europe first. We have, in Europe, in fact in the UK led it with one of the very first data protection acts. It was the model for the European directive, and now the European directive holds across Europe. It's 1995. It basically contains 8 principles. I haven't enumerated all of the principles here. The important points are that if you hold data on people, then it needs to be accurate. You need to be able to show a genuine need for holding that data. Now, need is interpreted fairly broadly. If it's conducive to your business model, then you're allowed to hold the data. But if you're trying to find somebody's favorite color and you're a bank, you don't need to know that. Really, that's beyond the pale. But you need to be transparent about it. If somebody says, "What are you holding on me?" you have to tell them, and you're not allowed to withhold anything. If somebody sends you a correction, you've got to honor that correction. So these people who phone you up and say, "We've got your record, you've got your phone on record," and you can say, "Take my name off your list, you don't need to know that." And by law, they have to comply, unless they happen to be phoning from India, in which case there's just no protection at all. From that point of view, the important thing is security and export. You have to keep the data under lock and key. You have to make sure that you might have a need to use it, but you have to make sure that only authorized officers get to see it. So just because you have data on somebody doesn't mean that you can show it to every employee of your company. You have to show to your employees what they need to know to do their job and no more. Furthermore, if you ever hand this data on to somebody else, which is a perfectly normal part of business, then you have to hand the data over to them just enough for them to enable them to do their job. Most important, if you're going to export the data in this way, you have to export it to somebody who has data protection standards in place at least equal to 95. Okay? Now that's the really important part of this. If you're going to export it, you've got to export it somewhere safe. You can't say, "I've now collected this, send it off to India," where India has no rules. You've got to send it to a company in India who's actually put correct correct protections in place. This is the situation now. Now, a little bit of technicality about European law. What a directive means is that it's the European Union directing the member states to enact laws to give effect to this directive. So basically what happens is they say, make the law, and the states have to make the law. But since 1995, there have been other states joining Europe who haven't enacted this law because they haven't been part of the directive. So their laws have fallen behind slightly. And so that was the reason for the orange in sort of particularly Eastern Europe. There is now a new regulation coming out. The regulation has been ratified, and it's going to come into effect sometime in 2015, probably late 2015, but maybe earlier if we're lucky. This is going to apply across Europe, across the board, no exceptions. It's a regulation, which means it doesn't need to be enacted by the states. It's enacted by Europe, and it immediately becomes valid in the member states. So its main purpose is to unify the European law. There are slight differences between Western states. You saw the differences between the Western states and the Eastern states. This gets rid of all of that. Europe will be one single block, basically conformant with these regulations. What's interesting about this is that it applies to the data pertaining to EU citizens, even when that data is held offshore. So, unlike any other law, this directive applies to your records on Facebook in the US. Now,
How's that enforceable?
bloody good question. Facebook does have subsidiaries in Europe, and you can go after them. They have offices in Europe, and you can go after them.
Not Facebook, but some other.
Yes. Yeah. Part of what it does is it introduces this concept of privacy by design. Now, in the old rules, in the old directive, what you were able to do was to build a system, collect the data, and then provide protection around that. As from next year, that goes. As from next year, what you have to do is you have to design in a concept of privacy. Now, I think that a lot of people are going to fall foul of this, and I'll tell you why. You hear a lot about hacking. If you go and have a look at the OWASP pages, then they will tell you how people gain unauthorized entry into systems. I was at a talk a couple of years ago where the head of security for BAE was telling me that actually, when you look at it, 90 to 95% of intrusions are inside jobs. They either are using, they're either done entirely by employees or officers of a company, or they're done with the collusion of officers of the company. And one of the things that he said was, you protect your perimeter by all means, but assume they're already in. And you have to protect your data on the assumption that the bad guys are already behind your perimeter. Now, I spent the night getting drunk with him. It was the most valuable night of my life. But since then, it has completely transformed the way I build databases and the way I build services, because it just changes your perception of what you're trying to protect. But this is the kind of thing which is going to come in. You know, this is the kind of thing which is going to be necessitated by these new regulations. There's also a duty to notify if there is an intrusion, or even an attempted intrusion. You have to notify the authorities. You also have to notify the subjects. Now, for a while, a lot of companies were a bit shy about owning up to these intrusions for a whole bunch of obvious reasons. But one of the things that it did was it made it very difficult for the police, or the law enforcement in general, the sort of international law enforcement, to actually understand what the nature of the intrusions were. And the intrusions are, by their nature, internationally orchestrated. And so this is partly that, you know, if your records have been lost, they need to tell you, but they also need to tell the police. So that's also added in there. And then finally, it puts in this right to be forgotten. Now, do you know about the right to be forgotten case that, oh, what was his name? The Spanish guy. I've forgotten his name. You know the case? Does anybody not know the case? Okay, basically, he didn't like the fact that the records were online. He certainly didn't like the fact that Google was linking to them, so he wanted not the records removed, but the Google link removed. It's bizarre. When the judgment came down from, and it was a European case, it came from the European Court of Justice. When the judgment came down, everybody was scrambling. Google, within the first 2 weeks, received 120,000 takedown notices under the right to be forgotten rules. And they simply couldn't comply. And so what they did was they took them all down and then complained back to Europe to say, now look, we have a duty not just to maintain the data, but we have a duty to not delete it unnecessarily. That's the other side of this, that, you know, it's not enough that you own the data, you've got to look after it. And they're saying, we're being forced to not look after it. So the right to be forgotten has now been softened, partly by this regulation and partly by case law since the Spanish guy. I wish I could remember his name. It basically means the right to be erased, provided there is no reason not to be erased. So if there's any public interest at all, if there's any debate about it, then the right to be forgotten doesn't apply. But it's in there. It's the fact that you can say, look, there is no reason for you to keep this. This is not sensible. And so you have a right to ask to be deleted. So this is the European model. This is what's going on here. And you can see basically what it's protecting. It's protecting individuals. Now, the US does it differently. In the US, they haven't got that same coherent message that we've got over here. For them, they've just got a whole lot of funny little laws sort of dotted around, covering just bits of the landscape. So there are a number of federal laws. There's things like the cybersecurity regulations and the wiretapping laws. Now, what those are about is you're not allowed to hack. You're not allowed to hack a company. You're not allowed to be hacked. There's a whole bunch of complicated things, but they're very, very specific things. If you post a privacy policy, it's got to be true. But there is no duty to post a privacy policy, and there's no duty to have one. There are particular categories of data which are provided, which are protected, and those are things like health and finance, military records, those kinds of things. And minors are protected, so you can't say what you like about children. Once they're 16, or in some states 18, then anything goes. So basically, if they know something about you, it becomes public. Within the states, each state has introduced its own laws and precedents. California has introduced laws something similar to the European laws, but not quite like it. Massachusetts doesn't have any laws per se, but it's got quite a lot of very interesting precedents which people have to abide by, which are providing more and more protection for individuals. But again, it's not really coherent, and it's not really a single message. Clearly, we cannot export European data to them because this isn't compliant with EC 95, not even close. And it's certainly not even, on the same ballpark as the new regulation. So the US have introduced something called the Safe Harbor Regulations. Now, what that means is that a company can say, okay, we are voluntarily, in addition to these responsibilities, complying with European responsibilities. And what that means is that it gives European exporters a protection against exporting to the American company. Trouble is, it's self-certification. It's not supervised by anybody. It's not actually that safe because when you look at the rules, they're not really EU compliant, and they are certainly, even these rules, are not compliant with the directive. So this idea of moving data across the Atlantic is going to become a lot harder than it is now. So that's the situation now. Now, this is a summary of what I've just told you, very briefly. And you can see that what the US cares about is about not the data itself and not the subject of the data, but where it came from. Has it been obtained legally? Has it been maintained legally? If you've made a promise, have you stuck to the promise? But this is all about the nature of the data. They're very, very interested in the idea of crime. They don't want people stealing money. In the EU, we've got a whole different set of worries. We care about the subject. We care about the individual. The individual just doesn't appear in here. It's identifiable individuals whom we protect. It's not companies. We are interested in misuse, but we're comparatively less interested in crime. The fact that somebody's stolen $100 million from a bank, we don't care about. That's an American care. We care that they've lost a bunch of customers' passwords while they're doing it. But the important thing to look at here is that neither of these has anything to do with aggregated data or anonymized data or anything like this. This is purely about personally identifying data. Okay? This is the traditional stuff. This is what you already know about. This is nothing to do with big data. It does not touch it. So, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to say, this is the regulation. We did some vox pops in the room earlier on, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the results of some of the vox pops. If you ask companies why, and to what extent they care about personal data, these are the things they worry about. Companies care about thefts. They care about people breaking in, stealing money or stealing confidential information or that kind of thing. They care about the embarrassment. They just don't want to be seen to be asleep on watch. They also care about sabotage. And there are numerous examples of sabotage from around the world, both commercial and military. And they are quite clearly cyber attacks. And some of them from our side, to be fair. So, but this is what the institutions care about. This is what company cares about. And these are very simple, very concrete ideas. But when you talk to individuals, when you talk to people, what they care about is something much more abstract and much more sophisticated. And we saw that when we had the Vox Pop in the room earlier on. So what do individuals care about? Oh, you stupid machine. Right. Okay. As I said, they're much more abstract ideas. People care about context leakage. Now, context leakage is, I get that you need to know this about me. I get that you need to know what my illnesses are to give me the right drugs. But I don't get that you have to give that information to a doctor. Now, this is a really basic thing. Let's take an example, a fairly extreme example. Let us suppose you are having an affair. Your credit card company knows about it. How do they know? You're renting motel rooms by the hour, and you're buying flowers when it's not your wife's birthday. And you don't care that they know, because all they have to do is give them the money. But if they sent you money off vouchers to VD clinics to your home address, now you care. Now that's an example of context leakage, and that's what everybody's worried about. Those tracking cookies, those third-party tracking cookies, it's context leakage. That's exactly what it is. We don't understand what it is, we don't understand why it's important, but we do understand it's that, even if we couldn't name it as such. Intrusion and betrayal. This is about identity. It's not about... People who've been burgled, they say it's not the fact that the things have gone, it's the fact that the house feels dirty. And it's that kind of thing. A good example of this are those naked pictures that were stolen from iCloud just recently. This was in the last couple of weeks, wasn't it? Now, I don't know if you've seen any of these pictures. Of course, nobody here would go looking for them, would they? But actually, they're pretty tame. There's nothing really special about them. But people feel, no, actually, this is invasive, this is intrusive. My face is my property, my face is my own. And they have no business using this without my permission. It's interesting that people are so interested in these pictures. I mean, there's celebrities having sex. Do celebrities have sex differently from everybody else? Well, they've got cameras rolling, so they must do. How about you guys? I mean, I don't do that. But it's this idea of intrusion. It's not the fact that it's a measurable, quantifiable loss. They couldn't go to court and say, look, you have cost me £30,000 and I want that back, because it hasn't cost you anything. But there's this sense of intrusion. And what's interesting about this is that the guys who stole those pictures, they didn't actually break into iCloud. They just walked in. iCloud had left the door open. Or in fact, it was the celebs who'd left the door open because they picked shitty passwords. So it was this sense of betrayal. They had trusted Apple with this data, and Apple had leaked it. And so there's a sense of, I trusted you and you have let me down. And that's a very strong sense that people feel. And the last one is unjustified enrichment. And this is, again, quite a hard thing to explain. It's not really part of common law. It's not part of the law that exists in England and the US, but it is part of European law and it is part of Scots law. And the idea behind unjustified enrichment is if you earn money, then you should have earned it. Again, to characterize it, you have these people who go, my cousin just won all that money on the lottery. And he gave me £100,000. That's skinflint. Who does he think he is? He didn't even earn that bloody money. Now, that's the sense of unjustified enrichment. So what you've got is you're earning money out of something that's not yours, out of something that you're not entitled to. So they didn't sell the pictures. They got kudos for the pictures. But had they sold the pictures, well, OK, they've done the work. They've got the pictures. They've downloaded them. They've done the hack. At one level, they should be paid for it. But on another level, no, that's not fair. That's not their pictures. The idea behind unjustified enrichment is not a concept of justice. It is a concept of fairness. And yet people feel it really deep down. And the reason why people get upset by hacks and by leaks is because of this sense of unjustified enrichment. Does that make sense? Does that chime with your own feelings? Is there anything which you'd like to add to this?
Just something that's sort of missing from your analogy about the pictures is that they were accessed legally, so it wasn't whether or not somebody has 123 as their password. The fact they guessed the password and entered system without permission is still illegal. That's why Mr. Colson is in jail at the moment.
Yes.
You know, so there's an extra layer. It's not just the case that people felt that their face or their whatever is being intruded upon. It's because it was as if someone had tried opening their front door and going in and taking something.
Indeed, and if somebody had tried to open your front door and had found it open and had burgled your house, it would still be burglary and you'd still be a damn fool.
You still feel a bit stupid, but it's still
Yes.
It's still illegal.
Yes, I accept that it's still illegal, but the reason why I'm going to push back against you is because to take the position as an absolute means that you're exonerating the owners, you're exonerating the person from locking their own front door. And I don't think you can do that. I think in a real world, you have a responsibility to pick sensible passwords. Yeah, you do.
Well,
Otherwise, it's going to keep happening. And the law can't catch up. The guy doesn't even know who he is.
you do have a responsibility to, but I get a bit concerned, and this has happened over these pictures, where people have said, rather than, you know, they, as you said, 4chan got kudos for it. They didn't get told, hang on a sec, you illegally accessed these photos. They got kudos, and it was the people who were victimised that were told, you're entirely at fault. And I think, if you want to be fair about it, yeah, I would never choose a stupid password, but I think the blame attributed has been mostly gone to the people that took the photos rather than the people that stole them in the first place.
I think that's true. I don't think it's absolutely true. I think that people, I think there have been people pointing the finger at the celebrities, but I don't think it's all been that way. I think that there has been a lot of debate about the illegality of the hack. I mean, nobody's calling it anything other than a hack, for example. So I don't think that it's all as one-sided as you're making out.
No, I'm not agreeing, sorry, I'm saying it, but
I think there's a degree of ignorance because I think that what had happened was people had set up their phones to automatically upload to the cloud and just weren't even thinking about it. And I do think that people have a duty to protect themselves, and they weren't thinking. And I think that, you know, it's difficult to censure somebody for not knowing about the technology. But, you know, if you're going to use the technology, if you're going to drive a car, you need to learn how to drive a car. If you're going to operate a phone, you need to learn how to operate a phone. And I think that one of the things that the case has done is it's brought home the necessity to do this. So it's again, it's a grey area, but we are dealing with grey areas here because we're stepping into some very unknown territory now. Okay, you're happy with that as a list? Anybody want to add anything? Okay. Now, what is changing? This is what has been going on for the last 20, 30 years, since the beginning of the internet. There has been this contract between you and the internet. You don't have to say anything on the internet. You can stay off, you can wear a tin hat, you can do whatever you like. But anything that you do say will be permanently recorded and might be used against you. So if you say something dumb on Facebook, it'll come back and bite you in the bum. And this is a perfectly straightforward contract. There are people who are not technically savvy who understand this contract. My parents, for example, will not use credit cards online and they will not use internet banking. And they do that because they believe that if they once step into that, it's a lion's den and they'll get hacked and they've only got themselves to blame because they don't understand enough about it to protect themselves. So they understand this contract even if they don't understand internet banking. And one of the problems that we have now, one of the debates that we have, is that grown-ups think that children don't understand this concept because they just brain dump onto Facebook and they don't realize it's going to come back and bite them in the bum. But at least people who even are not technically savvy, they understand this contract. But the contract has changed because of big data. You don't need to be active on the internet. You don't need to give people your personal data. Anybody who's got any kind of data is now aggregating it and is now putting it into data sets and is using it along with other things. And now, suddenly, you are not in control of your digital life and you're not in control of your digital persona. Other people are. This is what has changed. And that is directly changed because of this concept of big data which is spreading around the world. So, NSA, the NSA snooping, is precisely this edit. People are going, look, I'm just going to live my life, keep my head down, you know, phone my friends, and suddenly they're not keeping their head down. Suddenly every phone call is tapped, and there's somebody listening on the other end. Care data. that information that's private between me and my doctor, suddenly it's going to be spread all over the internet. So this, fundamentally, is what has just changed.
Just in addition, isn't also things that can be computed about you? So small bits of evidence, individual things, there's probably lots of things we know about each other, but we can't compute over huge data sets in our heads what that might mean for that person. But if once you put it online, people can look at all the small things you do and compute things about you that you don't want them to know about you.
Absolutely. And that precisely is this violation. It's this change of the contract. It's the fact that you don't need to say anything at all. But that what you do say, even anything that somebody else says about you, can be aggregated and now can be used and can come back, and things that you don't even know about yourself, people will now know and you don't know who they are. Suddenly you are no longer in control of your own persona, you're no longer in control of your own face. That sense of violation of privacy that I was talking about before, it goes right to the heart of this. Well, yes, it is about control, but it's about more than just control. We're going to explore what that is in a moment. But this is what I think has been introduced. Where did this violation come from? Why is this different? Well, the answer is that up until now, the entire debate about data protection has revolved around basically two agents. They are black. Okay, they are the subjects and the custodians. The subject of the data is you, the owner of the credit card, the owner of the medical records, who the data is about. And the subject is a term which is introduced by the Data Protection Act and also by the regulations. Then there is the custodian, or the controller of the data. They're the people who hold those records and who have a responsibility to look after them. And this has not been a problem at all. We saw those lists of what companies value and what individuals value earlier on. And even though those lists are different, they're generally congruent. You know, that if a company protects its interests, it's protecting its customers' interests. And if a customer wants somebody to protect their interests, then that automatically protects the company's interests. And so these two people, with these two different perspectives of what they care about, have largely been pulling on the same end of the rope. But what big data does is it introduces a third role. And I'm sorry, I just had to make up a name for this. It's a horrible word, but we don't have a name. There's people who are interested parties. They're not owners, but they are nevertheless interested to some extent. So here is an example of somebody being interested. Who supports a football team? Just the two of you? And you don't really care. All right. What's your team? Liverpool. Did you hear my language? What's your team? Okay. You own it? You paid for it? Show me the receipt. No, of course he doesn't own it. But you feel a sense of solidarity with it. You feel a sense of identity with it. It's a sort of a tribalism. And tribalism is wrapped up in interestedness as well. So if Liverpool sold its star player for a packet of peanuts, how would you feel about that?
I'd be upset.
Why would you be upset? He's not yours.
Resources.
He's not yours.
That's my team.
But there's a stake. You have a stake in the team, and you have a stake in the running of the team. And this is precisely what being an interested party is. So when we take, say, gene patenting, this is a really good example. In order to patent a gene, genes, and particularly a human gene, then a human gene will give you, say, a disposition not to develop a certain disease or not to be infectable by a certain disease or something like that. And you can extract that gene and you can use it to construct drugs. And the person from whom the gene is extracted can say, oh, wait a minute, that's mine. But actually, no, it's not. They're just an interested party in the gene because they've got lots and lots of genes. And this gene is shared with at least one other individual, otherwise they couldn't possibly have it. But not only that, in order to extract a gene, you actually need to go through a very large screening process. It's not enough to know that they've got the gene. You need to have a whole bunch of other people who haven't got the gene in order to isolate the gene that you care about. So that gene is, it's very difficult to understand any sense in which it is the possession of the person from whom it's been extracted, because it makes no sense as long as it's still sitting inside a cell. It's got to go through all of this other process to give it any value at all. And so for somebody to say, that's my gene, and you're making profits out of my gene, and that's not fair. this sense of my, when they say it, it can mean it's mine as it's my car, or it could mean it's mine as it's my football team. But we have these different types of possessions. And this here is where the problem occurs. Because if you understand, I mean, we know who the data about a subject belongs to, right? It belongs to the subject. Your address belongs to you. Your credit card numbers belong to you. Your phone number belongs to you. In fact, that's an interesting thing. Your phone number belongs to you, but the phone directory doesn't. And you can't stop the phone directory from being published because you're claiming copyright on your number. Okay, so that again is another sense of this. Your phone number is not something which you own, but it's something in which you have an interest. But when you go back to this list, which is the one that I showed you before, and you test that against the interested parties, then what you find out is that the argument, the disagreement, and all of the sense of violation and distrust, it comes from this interested party sense, this interest. So, the security services, who's listening to me? What are they reading about me? Well, this is absolutely about the subject data. This is about me. Who are they telling? What for? Well, that's the context leakage. Okay, who's listening? What do they care? That's the intrusion, the betrayal. Who are they telling? That's betrayal. Can we trust them not to take what they hear out of context? Well, that would be context leakage again. It's partly about trust. Now, in fact, they've actually shown themselves to be distrustful because every now and then you see a story in the paper about some loudmouth who's lost his rag and has threatened somebody or said something stupid on an airplane, and he's let off in handcuffs and charged as a terrorist when all he's done is lost his rag. So again, there's a lack of trust there among people. They just don't trust these people to be proportionate. Was it you who talked about proportionality? We will come back to proportionality. Okay, is this about national security or is it about covert policing? Again, this is that was something that we talked about briefly earlier on. But again, this is about context leakage. And it's a question about trust. But one of the things that we know about the security services is that it's not just your phone they're tapping, it's everybody's. And they're starting to assemble this picture from all of these little tiny fragments of data. So the problem that we have is not what we're saying on the phone. I mean, we're talking to the nephew and wishing him a happy birthday, and well, nobody's interested in that. But it's when you have lots and lots of little fragments of data that all come together and start to form a picture in somebody's mind, that is that sense of interestedness which is starting to come into the picture. Let's do the same thing with care data. It's my medical records. You've got no business selling them to drugs companies who are just going to make a profit out of my data. Do you see all of these objections? They all come back down to these things.
To be clear, are you saying that NHS data doesn't really belong to you? You're just interested in it, you're interested in that case?
Yes, absolutely. Because once it's aggregated, your medical history cannot make a new drug. But 100,000 medical histories, 10 million medical histories, they can. But it's very hard. The reason why you're an interested party is that, forgive me, you think you're the only supporter for Liverpool. You think you're the #1 fan, right? People feel that about their own data. So what happens is they don't realise that there's 10 million other records. They say, that's my record in there. That wouldn't be the same without me. When you're at a concert, I was there. What's the patriotism? This is the best country in the world purely because I was born in it. When you start explaining it, it's very difficult for it to make sense, but that's because it's not a rational thing. It's something which you feel inside. And so that's why it's not amenable to this sense of scale, that it is my data, and that counts for more than the 10 million other data. So yes, it's absolutely that. Your data being sold to drugs companies, your data being sold for mining to employers or to insurance companies, it's absolutely about this sense of interestedness. Okay, Facebook. Do you want to go through this? The Facebook scandal. Those are my friends. Those are my conversations. What gives you the right to edit them? Well, it's because it's what they actually do. You couldn't take a fire hose if you didn't. Here's another one. It's transparency. What is the basis by which you're deciding what to tell me and what not to? Because what the Facebook scandal did was it brought to the fore not just that you could manipulate people, but that they're having to take this decision at all, that there is some editorial going on which we don't know about. And that made people feel uncomfortable. So just saying, sorry, okay, we won't do it again, that actually hasn't put the genie back in the bottle. Okay? Are you seeing what I'm getting at here? I know I'm introducing a new idea, but we've got this, I'm trying to show you this sense of interested party, which only makes sense in the context of big data, which only makes sense in the context of an aggregation. And this is why the present law that we've got has nothing to say, because our present law is entirely about subjects, and the American law is entirely about the custodians. Right? And there is no law about this new thing, which we feel in here. Now, you can bet that the law is going to catch up. And you can bet that the law is going to catch up way, way, way too late to do any good, because that's just how it works. But in the meantime, there's going to be a lot of public opinion, which if you are handling people's data, and in particular if you're handling aggregate data, you need to understand. Because, you know, a bit of bad publicity can do a hell of a lot of damage, particularly in the internet. So let us give you a new map of the internet. Now, you remember those old maps of the internet when you have to have all the points and this is all of the servers. This is a much simpler map. The internet is divided into us and them and people in between. Us are the people who we trust. It's a small circle in which we are a significant player. So this is our family and friends, our doctors, social forums. Interesting thing about Facebook, I mean, I joked earlier on, that's between me and 6 million other subscribers. We don't see 6 million subscribers. We see 100 friends. Well, maybe 1,000 friends if you've got no friends. But it feels very small and personal. On the other side is them. Those are things like government, whom nobody trusts, the press, whom nobody with any sense trusts, big business, because you know that they're basically out to take as much money from you as you can because they're in business to make a profit, not to make you feel good about yourself, and criminals. Criminals is definitely them. And in between, you have these things like your bank and Tesco's, which actually don't give a shit about you. And you don't much really give a shit about them. They're just forces of nature. It's like sort of the tides, and you just got to put up with them. But the reason for putting this column in is that they are ambivalent. By their nature, they're ambivalent. This is your friends. These are the only people who can really betray you. These are the only people who can violate your trust. These people, you don't trust them, and they don't trust you either. So in your own mind, you treat those as opponents, and you treat those as your partners. And you're going to see that meme come out again, because you're going to see that what happens inside these groups is collaborative, and what's in there is competitive. We have a duty to remember our friends. If somebody comes into the room and goes, "Hi, how are you?" You think, "Oh, the fuck are you?" That's really offensive. It's hard for me because I'm face blind. I never remember anybody. You just have to tell me who you are if you walk up to me. But most people have this sense of if you don't remember your friends, then they feel upset by it. They feel neglected. On the other hand, most people would very much like to be forgotten by their government, even though it would be very uncomfortable if they were. Most people would very much like to be overlooked by criminals. So you have this sense of a duty to remember and a wish to be forgotten. And this is personal. You wish them to forget about you rather than they wish to forget about you. And the thing about us is that us, people in my us group, they share my agenda. All of my values, all of my agenda, where I want to go, they share. That's why I get to pick my Facebook friends. That's why I get to pick my doctor. Them conflicts with my agenda. This is, again, getting back to this idea of competition. And of course, the forces of nature, they're on a different path. You know, we can share a path, we can oppose a path, but you know, still get cheap groceries. Now, right now,
isn't the whole point of big data is the ones in the
Yeah, yeah, it is. And this is what's going to be coming out in the next few minutes. And oh, I'm home straight. That's pretty good. Yes. To be fair, it's both of these sides which are developing big data. Big data doesn't really make sense with this because this is by its nature small data. But big data is operating over here. But we start to care about these people as we start to understand the nature of big data. We start to care even more about these people. They cease to be mere forces of nature and start to become either us or them. So this middle ground is definitely going to shrink, precisely because you're going to be asking, what do they know about me? Why do they want to know that? And things like loyalty cards. We will continually hand over loyalty cards. Now, I joke that my loyalty card is what they use to decide which interesting lines to delete, because every time we buy something good and we pay with a loyalty card, they delete it. And it's a damn nuisance. But when we talk to them and we say, what are you using this data for? They say, well, to send you vouchers. And for a while, they were sending vouchers which had no relevance to us at all. And then they started to get good. And then I started to get nervous. What do they really know about me? So we need to worry about this center area. What is important is this. If you are going to handle personal data, well, you know what your responsibilities are. If you're going to handle aggregated data, you have to make damn sure you're in this group. Because if you're not, when that group disappears, you're in that group. And then you've got bad press to worry about. Does that make sense? And that is what this talk is about. This is why I'm standing up doing this, because we are going to have to worry about this over the next 5 years. Okay, so what's the difference? Good guys and bad guys. The good guys treat the interest as belonging to you. Liverpool. You have a card, don't you? You buy the kit. They sell you all sorts of things, like mugs and things.
I'll go along with this. I don't really.
Okay.
But yeah.
But the idea is that you have this collective interest, and they try as hard as they can to respect that interest, and they help you to express it. And, I mean, even though there's a lot of tawdry marketing going on, the idea behind it is that they're saying, yes, we value your fandom, we value your support. And this is the ways in which we value it. They will send you emails and they will join the fan club and all of that sort of stuff. So they treat the interest, they treat your interest as your property. But the bad guys treat interest as their own property. So the drugs company that's doing the gene screening, that's our genes. We did all the work. Look at all this room full of machinery. You would be nothing without this. So this is ours. And that automatically makes them bad guys. Now, we've talked rationally about why that happens and about who owns the genes. But the problem is right here. It's not the actual property at all. It's the attitude. And that is what makes people uncomfortable. That's what places them in the bad guys' camp. Does that make sense? Good guys collaborate. A great example of good guydom is open source software. Because everybody comes together and we're going to pull in the same direction and we believe in this software, and you get like this, a core of people. It might only be 3 or 4 people who really push the software forward. And the result is something which they're giving to the community, and the community applauds them for it, and everybody goes, yeah, yeah, and they stand up at conferences and they can take a bow. And it's all about collaboration and sharing. But bad guys, they steal value. They don't create it, they don't share it, they don't treat it as collaborated. They steal it.
Does that just make it a marketing problem then? Let's all work together to make better drugs.
Do you know what? Yeah. Yeah, in fact, let's talk about some of these. I mean, suppose GCHQ is listening. Who am I kidding? Of course they're listening. After the research I did for this, there's probably somebody in the room. How to make GCHQ be good guys? What's the biggest technological problem in your life? What really pisses you off? Spam and phishing, right? They have got computers all over the world. They could put a stop to it right now. They say to us, just send your mail through us, and we will put a stop to spamming and phishing in the next 6 months. What would you do? Actually, a lot of people would say, yeah, give it to me. Because that's Google's proposition. When you put your mail through Gmail and they say, we'll clean your mail, that's their proposition. So if GCHQ said that and then said, and we will go after the buggers and we'll bring them back in chains and prove to you that we've done it, then they're public. Now they're on your side. Now suddenly they're the good guys. Now it's collaborative. Now they take your data, they take your emails, they take everything about you, and they say, and we are going to give you the value from that. Look, cyber terrorists in chains. It proves it. Same with care data. If the NHS had said, look, we are going to sell this to buy drugs, and look, first of all, we save money. We don't have to go to the taxman. We can build 3 new hospitals with this money. And you know what else? We don't even have to pay for the drugs on the other end. Ain't that good? Isn't that worth dedicating your genes to? How many people would say, yeah, I'm up for that? Because what they've done is, instead of saying, okay, we are a big behemoth, we're a big organization, this is our data, and we're going to sell it if we want, now, suddenly, we're collaborating. We're growing a shared value. We all get to share in the spoils. And this is the key behind it. I think that if we're going to... The value of aggregated data is precisely that it's shared. And it is shared between the interestees and the custodians. So it's fair enough if everybody shares in the spoils. Yes?
That's all like Tesco's proposition at the moment with the club card and vouchers and what is. We know that they're going to be doing analysis on our aggregate data, but they pay us back in vouchers, and we can see in concrete terms we've got 50p off to the beans or whatever.
Yes, absolutely.
So they're sort of doing the collaboration thing, which is why we don't really care so much, maybe.
I think that's absolutely true, and I think that's why Tesco's get away with it. And there are other loyalty schemes which don't get away with it in anything like the same way. The Shell loyalty scheme, who cares? I mean, who even has a Shell card?
I do, because they keep nagging me every time I go into them.
Okay, so you're the only one. How many people have a Tesco's card? You see? And that's what the difference is, because Tesco's is genuinely sharing the spoils, well, to an extent.
Interestingly, with the Shell one, I feel like they care, but I don't. They've also got a message to really push it, and so they really do care, but I really don't care.
But it feels like they're mining you. It feels like they're not giving you anything in return. Yeah. And that's why you don't care about them, because there's nothing in it for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Good guys protect the data. Google, just recently, after the NSA stuff, has said, and I think Microsoft has done this too, they are routinely encrypting everything on their servers such that even they can't get at it. Spooks, take your chances. Now, the bad guys leak data. Was it JP Morgan who had the hack last week? Vast quantities of data that they lost. And they went, oh, shit, and that was it. Oh, too bad. Have I just gone backwards? Yes. So they leaked the data, and they almost didn't care. I mean, they cared about the lack of face, or the loss of face, but they actually didn't seem to care very much about the data that they'd leaked. When people said, has my password gone? They didn't know. How much money has been stolen? We don't know. Don't care. So they leaked the data. And the important thing about this is that to return to iCloud, iCloud said, what was their first reaction? It's not us. They were legitimate passwords. Nothing to do with us. The fact that they had allowed people to set up with stupid passwords, and the fact that they'd set the phones to automatic to upload the stuff, that was beside the point. Actually, it was perfectly clear to all concerned, and this is to come back to your point, that actually Apple had been dilatory, and they really hadn't been protecting their users' data. So in this case, Apple was definitely bad guys. And the fact that they're saying, nothing to do with us, made them even badder. So this is an example of really having a sense of who this data belongs to. And it's illustrated by the Apple case. Yes?
A lot of it's down to really poor reporting as well, because I actually didn't know before you mentioned that it was poor passwords. I assumed there was a leak from Apple. And I think there's a lot of interchangeability of terms in the media about what hacking is, about what leaks are and what have you. And certainly in this situation, I don't think it's Apple's fault in the slightest. I think it's a fault that people went in and the responsibility of the people that didn't protect their own.
I have a test for fault. I learned this when I was a driving instructor. People would have accidents, and they'd come back to me and say, well, I was driving down the road, and the guy came off the right side and swept me off, and there's nothing I could do. It wasn't my fault. I go, oh, yeah, OK. You're going to get caught out by that again? No way. I'm going to be watching next time. Then it's fault. What's Apple done that subsequently? They put two-step authentication onto the onto the cloud. And they did it in a week. So if it's not their fault, why have they done that? Of course it was their fault. In the same way, of course it was...
All they were trying to look like they were doing something to deal with.
And why would they want to look like they were doing something to deal with it?
Because it's good marketing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, good guys declare consequences. Google says, if you put stuff on our servers, then they're on our servers, we will read them. They're absolutely clear about it. Their quid pro quo is, we want your data and we will deliver service in return. They've even gone as far as to say, we will comply reluctantly with disclosure orders, but meantime, we will fight your corner. So Google is being absolutely open about the consequences. Meanwhile, how many times have you heard this? If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. Well, first of all, everybody has something to hide. But secondly, even if you don't have something to hide, of course you have something to fear. That's the whole point. That's the reason why America was created, in order to have a curb on the powers of the government. It's a ridiculous thing. But people say this all the time. Your data's safe in our hands. You've got nothing to fear. And nobody believes it. The moment those words come out of your mouth, you're a bad guy. Okay. Good guys reduce circles. You know about gamification. People have been gamifying products for the last 10 years, and you understand how it works. But the point about gamification is that it creates circles, and it spreads out the influence of the product, and it works as recommendations to friends. But it's bounded, it's limits. These things only grow to a certain size, and you tend to find that Facebook games, people will have 100 Facebook friends, but they will only have 10 people inside one game. Lots of things work like this. But if you've got small circles, then you have much better chance for collaboration. And collaboration is one of the key things of the good guy column. So creating circles, creating groups of people, if it's just you on your own, then it's you against the machine. If you've got a small group of people, then the machine fades out of view. So this is precisely how the Facebook circles work and why people think that Facebook communications are privileged. Because actually they stop seeing Facebook and they just see their friends. Does that make sense? What the bad guys do is they expand the circles. Amazon, incidentally, is quite good at this. They went through a phase of being terrible, but what they say is that you look at a book or you look at a piece of music and they go, people who like this. And for a while, I trusted them and I would buy music without ever having heard it because their judgment was really good. And then suddenly they started sending me shit. But they realized, well, actually, they just want to sell this stuff because they've got it on back order and it's taking up space in the warehouse. And so I stopped trusting them. So what happened was the perception changed. To begin with, they were giving me a circle and they're saying, your friends, even if you don't know who they are, like this. And then they went, but we got a warehouse full of this. And that turned them into the bad guys. And I stopped trusting them, and I've never gone back and tried it again. Good guys insure against accidents. Accidents will happen. Good guys will tell you that accidents will happen, and they'll even tell you how they happen. And one of the reasons for creating the duty to notify in the new European regulations is to underline the fact that history has shown that good guys do declare accidents. But what they then do is they then say, okay, we can limit this. Now, there was a case. I forget who it is now. It's going to come back to me. But it was a theft of passwords. And they just changed everybody's passwords. They said, you no longer have a login. And they started the new password process. So when you logged in, it said, what's your email? We'll send you a new link. And it automatically started the process. So they said immediately, the moment the leak was discovered, they shut it down. That puts you in the good guys camp. Because even though you've done that, it's limited your ability to do business. But on the other hand, it has protected your users' data. It's a slightly different context, but there was a good example of this, not in computers. This was back in the mid-70s. Johnson & Johnson, who owns Heinz, have what I think is one of the most inspiring mission statements I've ever seen. It's called the Credo, and they say, this is what we believe in. Our first priority is to the customers, to the families and healthcare professionals who rely on our products. And then it goes all the way down and says, and finally, we can make a decent profit for our shareholders. but their first priority is to their customers. Now, there was an example of an incident of food terrorism. Somebody was putting ground glass into baby food. And so Heinz, in fact Johnson, swung into action. They had the shelves cleared across America in 6 hours. People went into the supermarkets with shopping trolleys and just swept everything onto the baskets. And they said, we'll settle up later, but it's going. And then they started restocking the shelves, and this was very public, of course. Everybody knew that the attack had happened. Everybody knew what Johnson's response had been. Heinz suffered a similar attack by the same people. It took them 2 weeks to get their act together. And they never recovered their reputation. And now, if you go into the shops, you hardly ever see Heinz baby food. It's all Johnson's. Because, even in the 70s, people remembered that. Now, this was an example of insuring against the accidents. I know it's a different context, but this is an example of extremely good practice on this side. The bad guys amplify the accidents. JP Morgan is a great case. They just denied it was happening, and then they didn't do anything about it, and the passwords were all out. And we all know how secure people's passwords are. How many people use the same password for everything? How many people have 2 passwords? How many people have 3? How do you remember? How many have you got?
3 or 4, but 4 if I in one place.
Yeah. And that's how most people use passwords. So a password leak is really serious, particularly if it goes with a name and address. Okay, so if you're handling aggregated data, then, these sorts of things, to an extent, they're good practice with personal data. But without regulatory oversight and without understanding the notion of possession, this notion of interestedness, then it's very easy to get this wrong. And we can see that the intelligence service got it wrong. We saw that the NHS got it wrong. And as you go out and look at other examples, you'll see lots of big people who damn well should know better also getting this wrong. And so what you need to do as handlers of big data is you need to make sure that you're treating the big data not as if it's yours, well, certainly not as if it's yours, not as if it's personal, but as if it's this other thing as well, as if it's this interested data. And this is how you do it. This is the sort of thing that you're looking for. You're creating the smaller circles because you're creating smaller fan clubs, in effect. You're treating the stuff with respect because it's not all yours. There is an element of belonging to other people. Does that all make sense? Okay, here's a summary. We've got 10 minutes left before the end, and I'm not going to keep you from your beer. And you don't need to read this out. You can read it for yourself. Any questions? Any observations?
You mentioned the new law that's coming out.
The new regulation, yes.
How is that being publicised much? Because I haven't know about it, but the big corporations, governments mentioning it, where it's being publicised. I've not heard it come from our compliance department, for example.
Well, I heard of it, so it's been publicised as far as me. It has been being discussed for the last 3 years in the official journals. There are occasions. The duty is upon our government to tell us. This is not something. The EU will create these regulations and create the directives, but ultimately it's down to the national governments to effect them. I think you're probably right. I think not enough is being done to explain this. And I think that one of the things that's going to happen is it's going to get everybody on the hop. It did happen with the cookies rule. That had been going through the motions for months. And then suddenly there was this scramble in about 6 weeks, was it? And in fact, the data protection registrar said that he expected that very few companies would be compliant in time. And the view that they took was that, well, we know that it's a bit of a cock-up, so we will act in an advisory rather than a prosecutory role for the first few months while people are getting used to it. And people did scramble to it. But I also think that the new regulation is going to be a much more fundamental change. And I think it's going to take a couple of years to comply with it. And I think that, yes, you're right, lamentably, I think there's going to be a scramble. A lot of money to be made for a consultant, mind you.
Can you go back looks like?
Yeah.
We all work in IT.
Yep.
And work in most likely companies that are working out what they can do with big data and not do with big data.
Yep.
So how, and they would all want to be good guys, but how can they do it? I think this is the interesting discussion point. How can you be a good guy without just pretending to be a good guy?
It was Gerald Ford, wasn't it, who said the secret to success is sincerity. When you can fake that, you got it made. I think the answer's in the question. You be a good guy. I think that nobody wants to be a bad guy. But I think that people fall into it by accident. They fall into it through negligence, and they fall into it through carelessness. But I think that there is a genuine lack of understanding about what this third class of possession is. I had to invent a word for it. In the research I was doing for this, I didn't find a discussion anywhere on the internet about this. And yet it does seem to me to be absolutely the heart of what is going on right now. Because, as I say, at the beginning, I was sort of clowning a bit about what the positions were. And they make good humour, they make a good joke, because they don't stand up rationally. And yet, people do feel it.
If I have to go and speak to whoever, head of product for an insurance company.
Yep.
And they're all talking about big data and eyes are lighting up.
Yep.
How we can exploit this.
Yep.
And you say, well, you need to invest in this stuff to the left.
Yep.
But when it's just gut feeling, you need to be a good guy. It's really hard to make that convincing argument unless you can show them. If you get put in the bad guy category, maybe like that Heinz one, you never come out.
Yes.
So where's...
And JP Morgan will never come out.
If we could quantify it somehow, it makes it easier to convince these people that are making decisions on how to use data.
There are lots of cases of people who've got this right. There are lots of cases of people who've got this wrong. Fewer cases in big data, because big data is a new movement. But certainly in terms of personal data, you can see people getting it wrong. We know Apple got it wrong over the iCloud pictures. We know, you can just look. I mean, okay, how much damage is it going to do Apple? Well, probably not very much, because they're enormous anyway. They can afford a few bloody noses, but they certainly got a bloody nose from that. Morgan's, they are going to be in a lot of trouble over that. People are going to be leaving in droves over that. Not least because Morgan's is an investment banker for people who've got dodgy income. And they absolutely don't want those leaks because it exposes them not just to criminal attention, but to government attention as well. So they have seriously betrayed their stakeholders. And watch this over the coming weeks and see how much damage it does them. But their shares are at the moment. And it's as a result of that, I'm sure. So I think that if you want to convince your managers as to why it's worth being a good guy, well, you just point to the bad guys and see, well, and that doesn't take a lot of convincing. The next thing is, well, how do you be a good guy? Either how do you do it or how do you fake it? But I think it really is about, if you want one word to take away, it's collaboration. Let me give you an example of people who I think got it very badly wrong. That's Viva. They allowed you to put software on your phone and put it in your car and it monitors your driving. And they say, we will give reduced insurance to better drivers. And they'll give you a score out of 10, 8 out of 8.2, or whatever it is. And then you can go and really wave with your score with your mates in the pub. And, do you know how many people are using that? First of all, if you do get a high score, it reduces your insurance premium from outrageous down to merely usurious. They're 3 times the price of their nearest competitor. But secondly, it's not telling you the basis on which it's scoring you. In fact, the basis on which it's scoring you is compliance to speed limits and nothing else. And actually, that turns out to be a very bad predictor of accident rates. Now, if they were to either share that with you, or they were even going to say, we are going to monitor your driving and then correlate that with accident rates, and then modify your premiums as a result. Or we are going to give you advice, give you driving advice in order to keep you out of accidents. If they were to share the benefits of the data they're collecting, then I think people would be a lot more amenable to it. But the fact is that it's us. We've got a spy in the cab. And And people are treating it a lot like the way they treated tachometers, tachographs when they introduced them for lorry drivers. And they were treated with nothing but distrust because there was no payback. So I think that's the important thing. One takeaway word is collaborate. If you're going to harvest data from your users or from your customers, then give them something in return. Are you comfortable with that as an answer?
I want to talk more about it.
Okay. Well, look, the beers are being opened. Thank you very much for your time, guys. Thank you.